On the morning of December 2nd, 1859, John Brown rode from the Charlestown jail to the gallows that were prepared for his execution. He sat quietly atop his coffin as the wagon made its way to the place where the final chapter in this antebellum passion play would unfold. To understand Brown's actions, we must first explore the mind of the most controversial figure of this era. Was Brown a madman, or was he a zealous abolitionist with a true plan to free the slaves? Labeled as both a terrorist and a martyr, the debate still rages over his mental state and his motives. To understand the true psyche of John Brown, we must first examine the exchanges he had with fellow abolitionists in Hudson, Ohio, and his first encounter with the reality of the divide between North and South over the issue of slavery. That event was the murder of Elijah P. Lovejoy in 1837. Lovejoy, a staunch abolitionist in his own right, ran a newspaper called the Alton Observer. When the news was exchanged with a church gathering in Hudson, Ohio, the radical transformation of John Brown began. Standing in his customary place in the back of the church, Brown placed his hand on his Bible and proclaimed, "Here before God and these witnesses, I, John Brown, consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." For nearly 2 decades following this event, Brown would raise his sons to possess the same impassioned fury concerning the great stain of slavery.
Slavery is a sin against God and all mankind. And any government that styles itself a democracy, that condones, supports, protects, finances, and practices slavery is an abomination.
During these years, an uneasy political balance existed between the industrial North and the slaveholding South. With each new state being added to the Union, the delicate balance threatened to tip. In 1854, the territories of Kansas and Nebraska were ready for admission into the Union. While some felt the balance would remain unaltered, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act would shake our nation to its very foundation. When Brown arrived in Kansas, he immediately began to assess the situation and organized the abolitionist forces into a true fighting unit. Disgusted by the pacifist tone of many of the men, Brown proclaimed that these men are all talk. What we need is action. Action! Action is indeed what would follow. His actions in Kansas would have 3 great consequences. First, he turned the tide against the border ruffians who at that point ran roughshod over their abolitionist opponents in the territory. Secondly, his violent action made him a national figure, a terrorist to those who supported slavery, and a heroic hand of God to those who wished to see Kansas enter the Union without the stain of slavery. The third consequence is often the most overlooked. In each and every military engagement Brown had in Kansas, a distinct pattern was developing. His first violent encounter in 1856 was his most infamous. Following the sack of Lawrence, Kansas, the center of abolitionist activity in the territory, Brown sought out vengeance. In a scene that was seemingly ripped from the pages of the Old Testament, the Pottawatomie Massacre was carried out. Word of this atrocity spread throughout Kansas. The news was also exchanged with newspapers around the nation. While some would now certainly label Brown as a terrorist, others were attracted to this fiery zealot for his willingness to take a stand for the abolitionist cause. Brown's first true military encounter with pro-slavery forces came at the Battle of Blackjack. Although it was a relatively small engagement, Brown had new support from men who had previously sat idle. His reputation as a fighter was growing on the blood-soaked fields of Kansas. Brown's next major violent exchange occurred in August of 1856 when he met a much larger pro-slavery force in Osawatomie, Kansas. During the action, as was the case at the Battle of Blackjack, more men arrived to support him. These men allowed Brown to hold the high ground and force the pro-slavery men from the field. Brown, however, was a wanted man, and the pressure for his capture was certainly taking a toll. Oblivious to the gathering storm, He and his men had liberated 11 Missouri slaves before Christmas of 1858. By late January of 1859, Brown had led the slaves towards Nebraska when word of a federal posse in the area arrived. Once again, Brown simply sent out the word and help arrived, declaring he would not be turned from the path of the Lord. Brown's audacity and bolstered numbers demoralized the posse, and they spurred their horses and rode off without firing a shot, thus providing the name, the Battle of the Spurs. Emboldened by his success in Kansas, Brown now fled east to avoid capture and set into motion a plan to end slavery once and for all. Contrary to some beliefs, Brown had conceived this plan many years ago. The target was the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and Brown needed support. Funded financially by a group of wealthy northern abolitionists, he next sought out the assistance of Frederick Douglass. The two men met in a critical encounter at a remote stone quarry in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Douglass, however, would not offer his support, warning that Brown was walking into a perfect steel trap. Indeed, Harper's Ferry was a formidable target. Sitting low in a valley at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, and surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains, it seemed impenetrable. While some feel that Brown chose to be a martyr, based on the evidence in Kansas, Brown could have simply expected the same support he received during his actions there.
Most of all, he was expecting the slaves to rise up and support him. He would arm the slaves and take off into the mountains and build his army and train them to raid plantations. In Kansas, there were a lot of abolitionists that were behind him.
Armed with 1,000 pikes, Brown was anticipating help and support. Unfortunately for Brown, the plan met with total failure. The slaves did not rise up, but an angry, drunken mob did.
The townspeople resisted much more than we had expected. The militia mustered much more quickly than we anticipated. And as they mustered, they began searching for their courage in the bottom of a bottle.
Brown, however, was not killed. Badly wounded, he was captured and charged with murder, treason, and inciting a slave revolt. But when all seemed lost, and the name of John Brown was ready to be labeled a failure, and a mere footnote in history, his trial offered him an opportunity to exchange his thoughts on slavery to the entire nation. The fiery passion of John Brown caused the trial to become a national referendum on slavery. Newspapers from both the North and South covered the proceedings, and the nation became clearly divided.
But during that trial, Brown wisely understands that he no longer has the sword to fight against slavery, but he's got something much more powerful than the sword, and that's the word.
One question that was settled during the trial was that Brown would indeed become a martyr. He was found guilty in rapid fashion of all 3 counts. The execution took place just 6 weeks after he and his men first crossed the Potomac into Harper's Ferry. Southerners became convinced of a Northern conspiracy, and the Democratic Party was now fatally split over the slavery issue. The South, fearing another slave revolt, also began to take action. Local militias began to train and drill to be ready at a moment's notice in the event of another insurrection. Well trained and ready for action, they would become the backbone of the Confederate Army. With the Democratic Party in shambles heading into the 1860 election, the actions of John Brown certainly opened the door for the Republican Party.
The Democratic Party fractured over John Brown and the issue of slavery. There is no way Abraham Lincoln would have been elected in 1860 if there had been a unified, united Democratic Party.
As we can see, an exploration of the psyche of John Brown reveals much about his actions and their consequences. Inspired by his support in Bleeding, Kansas, he was certain of support for his Harper's Ferry raid. However, although the raid failed, his encounters with the press and his exchanges with the media clearly divided the nation and led us directly to civil war. In the end, his prophetic words prior to being led to the gallows certainly rang true. The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.